"Hey, junk boy! How much they paying you to haul off other folks' garbage?" a man hollered from his truck, and the whole street laughed. Isaiah Brooks didn't look up. He just kept loading another cracked, rotted fence post onto his rusted cart, the kind of wood every farmer in the county was glad to throw away. "Give it a month," the man called after him. "You'll be selling that dirt patch of your granddaddy's. Mark my words." "Maybe," Isaiah said. "Or maybe you'll want to see what I do with it first." They laughed harder at that. But less than a year later, those same trucks were lined up single file at his gate, and nobody was laughing anymore.
So what did that boy know that they didn't?
The land had a name once, though nobody in the county used it anymore. Folks just called it the old Brooks place, the way you'd point at a coat somebody had stopped wearing. 43 acres of tired Kansas ground that had grown soybeans and a little corn back when the rain came on schedule and the prices held. Neither of those things had been true for a long time. The soil out there had gone thin and pale as old newspaper, and the fences leaned like men who'd given up on standing straight. Elijah Brooks had farmed that ground his whole life, and his father had farmed it before him, back when a black family holding good land in that part of the state was a thing people remarked on, not always kindly. The Brooks name had survived droughts and bad loans and the slow arithmetic of low yields, but it had never once been left alone. There was always somebody driving past slow, always somebody at the feed store who figured the old man would sell any season now. Elijah was near 80, his knees were shot, and the doctor in town had told him quietly that his heart wasn't the machine it used to be. He kept a small handful of cattle out of stubbornness more than anything, a half-dozen head that grazed the poor grass along the back of the property and reminded him of the years when the place had been worth working. His grandson came home in the spring. Isaiah Brooks was 19 years old, lean and quiet, with his grandfather's long hands and a way of looking at things a beat longer than most people bothered to. He'd spent a couple of years studying regenerative agriculture, the kind of program where they taught you that dirt was alive, that a field was less like a machine and more like a body that could be healed or worn out depending on how you treated it. Everybody assumed he'd take that education and do the sensible thing, which was to leave, go to a city, get a salary, wear clean clothes on a Monday. That was what young people did when they had a way out. Staying was for people who had no choice. Isaiah had a choice, and he chose the farm. He couldn't have told you the whole reason in a way that would satisfy anybody. Part of it was Elijah, who had raised him when there was no one else to do it, and who had never once made him feel like a burden. Part of it was a single sentence a soil professor named Leon Gruber had said in a lecture hall 2 winters back. A sentence Isaiah had carried home in his chest like a coal that wouldn't cool. "Degraded land isn't dead land," the professor had said. "It's waiting land." Isaiah believed that. He believed it about the 43 acres, and on his stranger days he suspected he believed it about himself, and about the family name everybody in the county had already written off. The trouble was that nobody around there dealt in beliefs. They dealt in yields, in bushels and rain gauges, and the number at the bottom of the receipt. And the Brooks place wasn't producing a number worth respecting. So when the young man came back from his fancy schooling and didn't put in a proper cash crop, didn't lease the acreage out, didn't do a single ordinary thing a person was supposed to do with land, the town settled in to watch. They'd seen the family struggle before. They expected a familiar ending. Elijah watched too, but differently. He sat on the porch in the long spring evenings with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand and studied his grandson crossing the yard with that steady, unhurried walk. He had learned something raising the boy that most people never learn about anyone. When Isaiah went quiet and narrow-eyed and stopped explaining himself, the worst thing you could do was talk. The best thing was to leave him be and wait, because something was working itself out behind that face, and it usually came out better than anyone had guessed. So the old man said nothing when the deliveries started. Every few days, a truck would rumble down the county road and drop something at the end of the drive, and Isaiah would go out and haul it in. piece by piece, to the old cedar barn at the back of the property. From the porch, it looked like the boy was collecting garbage. From the road, it looked worse. What Isaiah was hauling in was fence posts, old ones, rotted, cracked, gray posts that other farmers had torn out of the ground and were glad to be rid of. He had driven the back roads for weeks, knocking on doors, asking in that polite, even voice of his whether anybody had old posts they wanted gone. Most people were happy to let him cart off their junk. A few of them, once they figured out he actually wanted the stuff, started saving their worst pieces just to see what he'd do. That was where the laughing started in earnest. The town had a name for him inside of a month: the Junk Boy. It got passed around the feed store and the diner counter like a coin everybody wanted to touch. Some folks meant it soft, the way you tease a kid you've decided is harmless. Others meant it with an edge, because a family like the Brookses getting ideas above their station was the kind of thing that had always rubbed certain people the wrong way. There were men who drove out of their way to roll past the property, slow, just to catch another look at the growing pile behind the barn and shake their heads and feel confirmed in something. A few of them went further than looking. It became a small local sport to leave the ugliest possible posts at the end of the Brooks Drive. Somebody dumped a load of black, waterlogged timber one night, half of it more mud than wood, and the story went around the diner the next morning to a good deal of laughter. Isaiah found the pile at dawn, and he didn't cuss and he didn't call anybody. He crouched down and started going through it, piece by piece, the way a jeweler goes through a tray. Because here was the thing the town never bothered to notice, being too busy laughing. Isaiah did not treat those posts like garbage. He treated them like inventory. He laid every post out on the swept floor of the cedar barn and worked down the rows on his knees. He ran his palm along the grain. He knocked on the wood and listened to whether the sound came back solid or hollow. He leaned in and smelled it, because a nose could tell you things about rot and species that eyes could miss. Cedar went into one row, prized, because cedar in the ground could shrug off rot for 30 or 40 years. Black locust, tougher yet, went into another. The soft gray pine that crumbled at the edges he set apart in a far corner. Not thrown out, just held separate, because he had a different job in mind for it. And he turned plenty of posts away, not the broken ones. The broken ones he often wanted most. What he rejected were the good-looking treated ones, the sound, heavy posts that had been pressure-soaked with chemical preservative, because that same chemistry that kept them from rotting would poison the living things in soil he was trying to bring back from nothing. The distinction made no sense to anybody watching. A man would haul over a truckload of solid treated oak, expecting thanks, and watch this teenager wave it off and reach instead for a rotten cedar rail nobody would use to prop a gate. Dale Forsythe, whose land ran up against the Brooks place on the west, was one of those men. He stood by his truck bed and watched the boy decline perfectly good lumber, and he drove home and told his wife over supper that the kid plainly didn't know what he was looking at. But Isaiah knew exactly what he was looking at. He pulled the nails from every post he kept, hundreds of them, until his hands blistered and the blisters went to callus. He measured each piece and wrote the numbers down in a green notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. And in the back of that notebook he was drawing things. Strange things, long curving lines across the graph paper. Not the straight lines a fence was supposed to follow. Slow arcs, bending with the shape of the hill. Whatever the young man was building out there, it was not a fence. Nobody in the county could have said what it was. By the time the ground firmed up in early summer, Isaiah had sorted and cleaned and cataloged enough posts to begin. And beginning meant committing, and committing meant money. There wasn't much of it. Whatever he had saved from his years away, whatever small cushion stood between the family and the edge, he had been keeping it the way you keep a held breath. Now he took it out and looked at it honestly at the kitchen table one night while his grandfather slept. Seed stock for the native shrubs he'd need, and a sack of grain sorghum on top of that, the toughest, drought-hardy crop he could find. The kind of grain that would sit patient in dry dirt when corn would curl up and quit. Hand tools, fuel for the old tractor, the dozen small costs of turning a drawing in a notebook into something standing on the land. If he spent it, there was no quiet fallback left, no cushion to reach for when the season went wrong the way seasons did. He was 19, and he was about to put everything the family had left on a theory that the whole county was already laughing at. He understood the stakes with a clarity that kept him up nights. If this worked, the ground would come back and the farm would have a future, and his grandfather might live to stand on healed land. If it failed, there would be no recovering. The savings would be gone. The bank, which had been circling the Brooks note for years, would have all the excuse it needed. Elijah would lose the last thing his own father had handed down, and Isaiah would have to carry the knowledge that he'd been the one to gamble it away, chasing an idea out of a lecture hall. He talked it through with his grandfather once, plainly, because the old man deserved that much. He laid the green notebook open on the kitchen table and tried to explain the curving lines, the way the posts would follow the slope instead of fighting it, the way the land might be coaxed rather than forced. He wasn't sure how much of it landed. Elijah looked at the drawings for a long while with his reading glasses down on his nose. "You believe in this," the old man said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes, sir," Isaiah answered. "I do." Elijah closed the notebook gently and slid it back across the table. "Then it's your ground to work," he said. "It was going to be yours anyhow. Might as well be yours while I can still watch." That was the permission Isaiah had been waiting for, and it settled something in him and frightened him at the same time, because now the only thing standing between the family and ruin was whether a teenager who'd never done this before had read the land right. The next morning he was out at the western edge of the property before the dew had burned off, driving the first cedar post into the ground along one of those long, curving lines. It did not sit in the straight, sensible row that fences had followed on that hill for 100 years. It bent with the slope, patient and strange, the beginning of an arc only he could see the end of. He stepped back and looked at the single post standing crooked against the morning, and then he picked up the next one and kept going. Dale Forsythe caught him at it about 2 weeks in. Isaiah had a good stretch of posts standing by then, marching along the western slope in that long, patient curve, and Forsythe stopped his tractor at the property line and let the engine idle, and looked at the thing for a while before he said anything. He was not a cruel man, exactly. He was a man who had farmed that country for 40 years the way his father had farmed it, in straight rows that went where a man told them to go, and what he was looking at offended something settled in him. "You're running them wrong, son," he called across the fence line. "Posts go in a straight line, always have. You lay them crooked like that, following the hill, first good rain's gonna come down that slope and take the whole business with it. You'll lose every one of them." Isaiah straightened up from his work and wiped his hands and thanked the man for the thought, honestly and without heat, the way he thanked everybody. Then he went back to setting posts along the curve. Forsythe sat there a moment longer, chewing on being thanked and ignored in the same breath, and then he put the tractor in gear and rumbled off to tell whoever would listen that the Brooks boy had been warned and hadn't listened, so whatever came next was his own doing. What came next was rain. It arrived about 3 weeks later, a proper Kansas downpour, the kind that stacks up gray in the west all afternoon and then comes down like it means to settle a grudge. Isaiah stood at the window past midnight watching it come, watching the yard go silver and the ditches fill, and something in his stomach turned over slow. He knew the ground he'd worked wasn't holding the way he needed it to yet. He'd known it was a risk. Knowing didn't make the watching any easier. By first light, the rain had thinned to a cold drizzle, and he was out in rubber boots before his grandfather woke, walking the western line with his heart going hard. Several of the posts had shifted. Not all of them, but enough. Enough that a man could see it plain, the once patient curve gone ragged in 3 or 4 places where the runoff had cut under the bases and let them lean and slide. Isaiah stood in the drizzle with mud climbing his boots and looked at what a single storm had done to 3 weeks of work. He did not cuss. He did not throw anything. He crouched down by the nearest leaning post and put his hand against the wet wood and just looked at where the water had run, reading the ground the way you'd read a page. He was still out there when the road brought its usual traffic. Word of a good downpour travels a farming county fast, and so does the memory of a warning given. Foresight drove past slow and didn't even have to say anything. The sight of the young man standing over his tilted posts in the rain said it all for him. By that afternoon, the diner had the story, embroidered a little, and the laughter had a harder edge to it now, because now it wasn't just that the junk boy was strange. Now it was that he'd been told right to his face, and the telling had come true inside of a month. A couple of the older men took it further. They started dropping by Elijah's place, friendly as anything, to sit on the porch and work the old man around toward the sensible thing. Sell now, they said, while the ground still had a number on it, before the boy pours what's left into the mud. You've carried this place long enough, Elijah. Nobody would think less of you. Elijah gave them coffee and gave them nothing else. But Isaiah, coming up from the field muddy and quiet, heard enough through the screen door to know the circling had started in earnest, and that the storm had cost him more than posts. Isaiah spent 2 weeks after that storm doing the hardest thing there was for him to do, which was to sit with a failure long enough to learn from it instead of running from it. He filled pages of the green notebook. He walked the ruined stretch of line a dozen times in different light, and slowly the thing turned over in his head until it landed somewhere new, because he had come to believe out there in the mud that a failure wasn't the end of a plan. It was information, and information was something a man could work with. What the water had taught him was this: the curving lines weren't wrong. The reading of the slope was right. What was wrong was that he'd trusted bare soil to hold the posts, and bare soil that had been worn out for 30 years couldn't hold anything yet. The posts needed something more than dirt to anchor them. They needed the ground itself to be alive again, gripping from below. He didn't have the whole answer, but he knew now that the answer wasn't in the town, and it wasn't in the notebook either. It was out past both. So he made a phone call, and then he made a drive. 3 hours north, there was a woman named Rhonda Keach, who had spent 30 years advising farm operations across 3 states for the Conservation Service. A plain-spoken, weathered woman with no patience for foolishness and no cruelty in her either. Isaiah had gotten her name from an old extension pamphlet, and he half expected to be brushed off. Instead, she told him to bring his drawings and come up. He spread the green notebook open on her office table, the curving lines and the post counts and the careful measurements, and he braced himself for her to explain, kindly, everything he'd done wrong. She didn't. She bent over the pages and worked through them without a word, tracing the arcs with one finger, and the longer she looked, the more still she got. "Where did you get these posts?" she asked finally. "Collected them," Isaiah said. "Old fence posts, ones people were throwing out." Rhonda looked up at him then, over the top of the drawings with a different expression than the one he'd walked in expecting. "The cedar ones will sit in the ground 30, 40 years without rotting," she said. "You know that. That's why you kept them separate from the pine." It wasn't a question, but he nodded anyway. She looked back down at the arcs. "And laying them on contour like this, following the slope instead of cutting across it, that slows the water down instead of letting it run. Builds organic matter along the line. You're not just fencing." Her finger stopped on the page. "You're building a windbreak and a wildlife corridor at the same time." Isaiah had known most of that in pieces. He had never heard anyone lay it out whole in a single breath, as though it were obvious and sound, instead of the crazy notion the whole county said it was. Something in his chest loosened that had been clenched for months. Then Rhonda asked the question that changed the shape of everything. "What are you planning to plant between them?" It was the first time in his life anyone had asked him that. Not "what are you doing out there?" Not "why won't you quit?" Not "when are you going to sell?" "What are you planning to plant?" A question that assumed the whole thing was already real, that took his work seriously enough to ask what came next. He heard it land, and he understood that he had driven 3 hours to find the one person who saw the same thing he saw. He told her his half-formed idea, and she took it the rest of the way. The posts, she explained, should never have been asked to hold on their own. Between them, he should plant native shrubs, deep-rooted things whose roots would grip the posts and the soil together far better than dirt ever could. Wild plum, elderberry, dogwood, things that fed pollinators and gave cover to birds, and the birds would eat the insects that chewed up crops, so the whole living line would defend itself. And in the sheltered ground, the line protected. The strip that would sit calm and moist in the lee of the hedge, that was where his sorghum belonged, tucked in behind the living wall where the wind couldn't strip it and the water wouldn't run off it. What he'd been drawing wasn't a fence, and it wasn't even really a windbreak. It was an old, nearly forgotten thing called a hedgerow, a living boundary that worked as windbreak and water catch and wildlife corridor all at once, being rediscovered on the far edges of the farming world by people doing what Isaiah had stumbled toward alone. He drove the 3 hours home in the dark with the whole thing blazing in his head, and somewhere on that road, the story he was living quietly changed. It stopped being about saving one worn-out farm. It became about building something nobody in that county had ever seen, something the land had been waiting on all along. What Rhonda had given him was a vision. But a vision doesn't dig its own holes. The doing of it fell on one pair of hands, and for most of that summer and into the fall, those hands were Isaiah's alone. He worked the living line the way the woman had taught him. Between every third post, he set a native shrub, wild plum and elderberry and dogwood, easing the young roots into the ground where in a season or two, they would reach out and take hold of the posts and the soil together and knit the whole leaning line into something that gripped from below. That was what the drawings had been building toward the entire time. He hadn't been putting up a fence. He'd been laying down the skeleton of a living thing, and now he was giving it flesh. In the sheltered strip behind the hedge, in the calm ground the line would guard from the wind, he drilled the grain sorghum in careful rows. It was the one part of the whole plan that looked to a passing eye like ordinary farming. And it was the part that would either feed the family through the winter or stand as the plainest possible proof that the boy had wasted the last of their money. He watered it in and watched the first green needles come up out of the dust and tried not to count on them too hard. He did more than plant, too. Some of the soft gray pine, the crumbling posts he'd kept separate in the far corner of the barn all those months, he didn't set upright at all. He dug shallow trenches along the contour and laid those posts down flat and buried them. An old technique where decaying wood works like a buried sponge, drinking in the rain when it comes and letting it back out slow through the dry weeks. The posts the whole town had laughed at were going into the ground to feed it from underneath. Every kind of wood had its purpose. The cedar and the locust stood as the bones that would last for decades. The rotting pine went under to hold water and break down and feed the fungi and the worms. Every post he'd sorted and smelled and measured had a job, and now, one by one, each was doing it. He moved his grandfather's few head of cattle up to graze along the finished stretch of hedge, where the shrubs threw a little shade and the grass had started, just barely, to come back thicker than anywhere else on the property. The animals settled there, calm, and their hooves worked the ground without churning it to the hard, airless pan you saw wherever livestock crowded bare dirt. It was a small thing, but Isaiah noticed it and wrote it down, because he was learning to trust the small things the land was telling him. It was slow, brutal, lonely work. He was out before light and out past dark. His savings thinned steadily toward nothing as the seedlings and the seed grain and the fuel and the dozen small costs added up. There were stretches where he wasn't sure he'd have enough to finish what he'd started, and finishing half a living hedge would be worse than never starting one. And the town did not soften. If anything, the tilted posts after the storm had given the laughter a second life. The junk boy was still the junk boy, only now he was the junk boy who'd been proven a fool and was too stubborn to admit it. Nobody who drove past saw a hedgerow. They saw a strange, ragged line of gray posts with little sticks planted between them and a thin stand of grain behind it. And they saw a young man wearing himself down over garbage, and they felt certain, in the comfortable way people feel certain about things that don't cost them anything, that nothing good could come of rotten wood. The hardest part was closer to home. Elijah was failing, not fast, but steadily, the way an old fire settles. He still came out to the porch on the good days, still watched his grandson cross the yard, but the walks he took got shorter, and there were mornings he didn't come out at all. The doctor's quiet warning about his heart sat in the house like a piece of furniture nobody mentioned. Isaiah felt the clock in it. The thing he wanted most in the world, more than proving the town wrong, was for his grandfather to live long enough to stand on healed ground and see that the gamble had been worth it. Some nights Isaiah sat at the kitchen table with the green notebook and did the arithmetic of it all. The money running down, and the season running out, and the old man running down too, and the weight of it pressed on him from every side at once. He had bet everything the family had left on the idea that worthless wood could bring dead land back to life, and there was no one to share the bet with, and no way to know yet whether he was right. He would close the notebook and turn off the light and lie awake, and in the morning he would get up in the dark and go back out to the line, because it was the only answer he had. The drought came in like something that had made up its mind. It started as a dry spell, the kind the county had shrugged off before, and then the weeks stacked up without rain, and the shrug turned to worry, and the worry turned to something quieter and worse. The sky went from blue to a white, pitiless glare that sat over the country day after day. The corn in the straight fields curled and paled. The ponds pulled back from their banks and showed cracked mud. Old men who'd farmed through the hard years said they couldn't remember a stretch this long this early, and they said it with the particular fear of people watching a whole season die on the stalk. For Isaiah, it was the one test he could not afford. Everything he had built was young. The shrubs between the posts were barely rooted, a single season in the ground. The buried pine had had only months to soak and settle. His sorghum was standing out there in the lee of a hedge that was still half a promise. He had bet the family's last cushion on the idea that a living line could hold moisture and hold soil, and now the driest year in memory had arrived to ask the question before his work was anywhere near ready to answer it. If it failed here, it failed completely. There would be no second season to get it right. And failure now meant more than a lost crop. The savings were gone, spent into the ground. A failed harvest meant nothing coming in against the note the bank had been circling for years, and everyone knew what the bank would do the moment the Brooks place missed. It would take the land. The 43 acres Elijah's father had handed down, that the old man had carried through every hard year of his life, would go to auction, and all of it, the sorting and the smelling and the blistered hands and the curving lines and the whole strange, patient faith of it, would come to nothing but a story the county told about a boy who'd poured his family's last dollars into rotten wood. Elijah was very weak now. He kept mostly to his chair by the window, and from it he could just see the western slope where the line ran, and Isaiah caught him looking out that way sometimes with an expression the young man couldn't read and didn't have the heart to ask about. The clock he'd been feeling all summer had gone loud. He understood, without letting himself say it plainly, that his grandfather might not have another season in him, and that whatever this ground was going to prove, it would have to prove it now. Isaiah walked out to the line in the worst of it, in the white glare with the dust lifting off the neighboring fields, and he stood among his young shrubs and his gray posts and his thirsty grain, and felt something in him come near to breaking. He had done everything he knew how to do. He had read every page, driven every mile, driven every post. And it might simply not be enough. The land might not have had time. He might have been right about everything and still lose it all to a matter of months. He came in that evening with the dust gray on his face and sat down across from his grandfather and didn't have a single hopeful thing to say. Outside, the drought pressed on the country like a hand. The first harvest was coming, the one that would settle whether any of it had meant anything, and Isaiah went toward it with almost nothing left in him but the habit of not quitting. The thing nobody in the county expected happened quietly, the way real things usually do, without anyone around to see it start. The harvest came in under that same white sky, and across the country it came in ruined. Field after field of straight-rowed corn and soybeans had cooked in the ground, the yields cut to a fraction, some acres not worth the fuel it took to run a combine over them. Men who'd farmed the sensible way their whole lives stood at the edges of their fields and looked at what the drought had left them and did the grim arithmetic of a year they wouldn't recover from soon. It was the worst season the county had seen in a generation, and it fell on everybody the same. It did not fall the same on the Brooks place. Isaiah had gone out to the western slope at dawn on the day it finally became undeniable, not expecting much, braced the way a man braces for bad news he already knows. And he stopped at the top of the line and looked down it and could not, for a moment, make his mind agree with his eyes. The hedgerow was green. Not lush, not showing off, but alive, holding, when everything around it had gone to dust. The wild plum and the elderberry and the dogwood between the posts stood with their leaves still on them, their roots reaching down into ground that had stayed damp when the bare fields on either side had turned to cracked pan. Along the buried line, where the old gray pine lay soaking underground, the soil was dark and cool to the touch. The curving posts had slowed what little moisture the year had given and held it there, and the young roots had gripped the soil against the wind that stripped the neighboring acres bare. And inside that patient line, a small country of green had come through a year that killed everything outside it. And in the sheltered strip behind the hedge, the sorghum stood. That was the part that stopped his breath. The grain had come up strong in the calm ground the living wall had guarded, heads heavy and full where every other field in the county hung empty. It had drunk from soil the buried wood kept moist, sheltered from the wind that had burned the straight fields brown, and it had made a crop, a real crop, a stubborn wall of grain standing in a dead year. Isaiah crouched down and pushed his fingers into the dirt at the base of a plum shrub, the way Rhonda had shown him, and it gave under his hand, dark and crumbling and full of life, the exact opposite of the airless gray pan the whole county was standing on. Behind him, his grandfather's cattle grazed the green hedge line, calm and unbothered, the ground under them soft, none of the deep, ruinous compaction you saw everywhere else. He knelt there a long time while the sun came up. He had bet everything the family had on the idea that worthless wood could bring dead land back to life, that degraded land was only waiting land, and the driest year in living memory had come to put the question to him before he was ready. And the land had answered. It had answered while everyone was looking the other way, laughing. The grain he brought in off that sheltered strip was not just alive, it was strong. Where the county averaged next to nothing, the Brooks place came in with a yield that made no sense against the season. Numbers that a man reading them cold would have refused to believe. The living line had done every single thing Rhonda had said it would do, and one thing besides. It proved it in the 1 year hard enough to leave no room for luck or argument. Isaiah didn't run to town with it. That wasn't in him. He walked back up to the house instead, to the chair by the window where his grandfather sat looking out at the western slope with that expression the young man had never been able to read, and he crouched down beside the old man and told him plainly that it had worked, that the line was green, that the grain had made, that the ground had held. Elijah didn't say much. He reached over and put one of those long, worn hands over his grandson's, and he kept looking out the window at the green line running along the hill where every other field in the county had gone to dust, and something in his face eased that had been tight for a very long time. The gamble had come in. The waiting land had waited for them both. Word of a green field in a dead year does not stay quiet long. It was Rhonda Keach who came first, because Isaiah had called her the same week, and she drove the 3 hours down with somebody riding along she wanted him to meet. It turned out to be a face Isaiah already knew, an older man with dirt-worn hands and glasses down on his nose. It was Leon Gruber, the same soil professor whose one sentence had sent Isaiah home to try any of this in the first place. Rhonda had known him for years through the extension network, and when she'd told him what she'd seen on a worn-out patch of Kansas ground, he'd asked to come and see it for himself. Gruber walked the length of the hedgerow for the better part of an hour and said almost nothing. He took samples along the line and back in the dead ground beyond it for comparison. He crouched at the base of the shrubs and turned over handful after handful, dark and crumbling in his palm, and he looked at the calm cattle in the soft, uncompacted ground where they stood, and the heavy grain in the sheltered strip. And finally, he asked how long this section had been in regenerative rotation. 1 season, Isaiah told him. Gruber looked at the young man over the top of his glasses for a moment, and then he looked back down at the soil in his hand, and whatever he was thinking rearranged something behind his eyes. He remembered the quiet kid in the back of a lecture hall 2 winters gone. He had said a sentence that day he'd said 100 times to 100 rooms. Degraded land isn't dead land, it's waiting land. And he had never once, in all those years, watched somebody walk out and actually prove it on the worst ground they could find. He straightened up slow and looked out along the green line running through the dead country and didn't try to hide what was on his face. After the scientists came everyone else. Agricultural people from 2 counties over drove out to walk the line. Then people from farther than that, once the numbers off that harvest started moving through the networks where such numbers travel. They came to see the thing that had held a crop through the worst drought in a generation on ground everyone had written off, built out of fence posts a town had thrown away. And the more of them who walked that curving green line, the more the thing Isaiah had built stopped looking like a strange boy's foolishness and started looking like the future. Then came the ones who wanted to buy. Not the land, the knowledge. Investors and farm operators who understood, faster than any neighbor had, what a system like this was worth in a climate that kept sending years like the one just passed. They wanted the design. They wanted the seed stock off his own established shrubs. They wanted him to walk their ground and tell them where the lines should run. Isaiah, who had started the spring with almost nothing and ended it near broke, found himself with more paying work than one pair of hands could hold, and the value of the healed farm, the ground and the living system and the name attached to it, climbed past a number that would have made the whole county choke on its coffee a year before. More than $1 million, the appraisers said, and said it plainly, as a fact. The bank stopped circling. There was nothing left to circle. And the pickup trucks came back. The same trucks that had rolled past slow to laugh, that had dumped waterlogged junk at the end of the drive for sport, now turned in at the Brooks gate and parked, and the men climbed down and stood at the edge of that green line with their hands in their pockets. Quiet, for once. Dale Forsythe was among them. He had run his tractor up to that fence line months back to tell the boy he was doing it wrong, and he'd been right about the first storm, and he had been wrong about everything that mattered, and he was man enough, standing there, to know it. He looked at the calm cattle and the dark soil and the heavy grain and the row of old cedar posts threaded through now with living green, and he worked his jaw a while before he got it out.
I thought you didn't know what you were doing, Forsythe said.
Isaiah didn't answer that the way a younger, angrier version of himself might have. He didn't say, "I told you so." He looked out across the hedgerow, at the windbreak that would shield the ground through every winter to come, at the corridor that had drawn birds back to land that hadn't heard them in years, at the whole living proof of a thing he'd believed alone for a long time. "I didn't at first," he said. "I just kept going." And through all of it, through the scientists and the buyers and the neighbors come to make their peace, the old man lived to see it. Elijah sat by his window and watched the trucks turn in at his gate for a reason his father would never have dreamed. And he knew, before he let go of anything, that the ground was safe in his grandson's hands. Elijah lived to walk the line one more time. It was a warm afternoon the following spring when he asked to go out to it, and Isaiah walked slow beside him the whole length of the western slope, the old man's hand trailing along the cedar posts he'd once watched his grandson haul in like garbage. The hedgerow was coming into itself now, the plum and the elderberry filling in thick and green between the gray wood, and a meadowlark lifted out of the brush as they passed and went up singing into a sky that had finally, mercifully, given rain again. Elijah didn't say anything out there. He didn't need to. He had lived to stand on healed ground, and that was the whole of what he'd wanted. When the old man was gone, Isaiah did not become what the county might have expected of a young man who'd been laughed at and come out on top. He did not lord it over anybody. He did not sell his knowledge only to the ones who could pay the most. He started holding open days on the farm, free to any grower who wanted to come and learn, walking them along the living line and showing them how to read a slope and sort a pile of cast-off wood and coax a worn-out field back toward life. The men who had once called him the junk boy sent their sons and their neighbors to those days, and Isaiah taught every one of them the same, without a single word about how any of them had treated him when it was easy to. That was the part people found hardest to understand, the ones who only knew the shape of the story from a distance. They thought the point of it was that he'd won, that he'd proven the whole town wrong and gotten rich doing it. But that had never been the point, and Isaiah knew it, standing out on the line in the evenings with the notebook, thicker now, still in his jacket pocket. The point was that nothing is worthless until you've understood it, and understanding takes a patience most people won't spend. He'd spent it on a pile of rotting fence posts, and on 43 acres of tired ground, and, if he was honest, on a family name a county had been ready to bury. The land had been waiting the whole time. It only needed someone to believe it was waiting and not dead, and then to do the slow, unglamorous work of proving it. And maybe that's the part worth carrying home from a story like this one, because everyone has a pile of broken fence posts somewhere in their life, a thing, or a place, or a person, or a version of themselves that the people around them have already decided is worthless. It's the easiest thing in the world to agree with them, to drive past slow and shake your head and feel confirmed in something. It's a great deal harder to kneel down in the mud and ask what a thing might be good for before you throw it away. Isaiah Brooks didn't have money, and he didn't have the town on his side. And for a long stretch, he didn't even have proof. What he had was the willingness to look longer than everyone else was willing to look, and to keep going after the first storm knocked his work sideways, and to treat a failure as information instead of a verdict. That's not luck, and it's not magic. It's a choice, and it's one that's open to just about anybody on just about any ordinary morning. So here's the thing worth leaving you with. The value in your life is very rarely sitting in the things that already look impressive. More often it's off in the corner somewhere, gray and cracked and easy to laugh at, waiting on somebody patient enough to understand it. Be the person who kneels down and looks. If any part of Isaiah's story stayed with you, I'd honestly love to hear which part. Was it the moment the hedge came through the drought green? The old man walking his line one last spring, or something quieter that just landed for you? Tell me down in the comments, and tell me where in the world you're listening from, because this little community reaches farther than you'd ever guess, and it's a good feeling to see just how far. If stories like this one are the kind of thing you want more of, go ahead and subscribe and stay a while. There's a new one every week. Thank you for spending this time here. Take care of yourself, and take a second look at the things everybody else was quick to throw away. You never know what's only been waiting.